So there are a lot of fiber sources available. They're probably not all the same in terms of the buffering capacity that they provide. And so that is kind of an emerging area of research that we're trying to understand. What are the value of these different roughage sources? How do they compare to one another? And we're really able to do that a little bit more now that we have more technology to kind of measure some of the outputs associated with rumen health and what we're trying to get out of these fibrous ingredients in the diet.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Feed Science podcast show, brought to you on behalf of Wise Genetics. I am Wilmer Pacheco, and I am an associate professor in the Department of Poultry Science at Auburn University. We are dedicated to bringing you the latest insights and discussions in the feed industry. Get ready to expand your knowledge and stay ahead with today's episode. And today I have the pleasure of having as a guest Dr. Kendall Samuelson. Dr. Kendall is an associate professor of animal science at West Texas A&M University. In her current role as an associate professor of Feedlot nutrition and management, Dr. Samuelson teaches courses in feedlot management, feeds and feeding, ruminant nutrition, and digestive physiology. Dr. Samuelson also has an active research program that focuses on developing applied solutions for feedlot cattle producers to address topics like receiving cattle nutrition, recommendations for starch and fiber concentrations in finishing cattle diets, metabolic health, and nutritional and management strategies to reduce liver abscesses prevalence. Hello, Kendall. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you for being with us, Kendall. And could you please share some insights of your professional experience with our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, maybe a little bit of a unique background in the ag industry, probably becoming more common today based on my experience with the type of students that I see kind of in my teaching role. So originally, I actually don't come from an agriculture background at all. I'm born and raised in kind of outside the Bay Area of California, which when I tell most people that, they think that's kind of a funny place for a feedlot nutritionist to be from, right? And so growing up, I lived in the suburbs of San Francisco, kind of in a more urban type environment. And so there just wasn't a lot of opportunities at that time for me to get involved in the agriculture industry. For whatever reason, I don't know, I felt that this was a place I needed to be, and I was always really interested in livestock. At that time, really didn't know what the job opportunities were because I just had not been exposed to that. I hadn't had the opportunity to see anything like that in my, high school time or anything. And so I decided I was going to be a veterinarian. And I would say that's probably a lot of the students that I see today, yes. 80% maybe are coming in as a pre-vet student because those students just don't know what are the different job opportunities that are available. And it's like, if I'm going to work with livestock, I have to be a vet, right? And so that's kind of how I started. I did my undergrad at Chico State in Northern California and figured out pretty quickly when I went into class with all of these other kids that had been in 4-H and FFA, and I had never been a part of that. Like, I don't really know anything about this industry, right? So they had an opportunity there where you could work at the university farm on these different livestock units for course credit. And I figured out pretty quick, hey, I need to get some experience. And so that was really the first exposure I had to production ag. And I just really liked it. I liked, pretty much everything about it. I started out in the sheep unit. I spent some time in the beef unit, and it was just a really exciting time for me as a young student to come in and get these new opportunities that I had never had access to before. And so I realized pretty quickly, hey, there's all these other options besides just a career in veterinary medicine, and maybe more of a production approach is kind of what I wanted to take. And I took some undergraduate courses, had some really great mentorship from the faculty there, and got to be a part of some cool things like different lab techniques and different undergrad research and things like that, and just really liked it. And so decided maybe I wanted to pursue an advanced degree. And so from there, I decided I wanted to experience something completely different. So I needed to move out of state to do that. And I moved to San Angelo, Texas. Had never been to Texas before in my life, had never seen Texas. I decided that was a good idea. It was very different from, growing up 30 minutes from the beach my whole life. Moving to West Texas in the middle of a huge drought was a stark contrast for what I was used to, but really a great experience for me. I started out actually in more of a range nutrition program at that time because I just didn't really, I knew I wanted to do nutrition. I was very excited about that, but I didn't know what the different opportunities were, and got that experience there, decided I didn't want to go the range nutrition route, and was actually maybe more interested in confined feeding and having a little bit more control over those animals' feeding programs. And so my master's primarily was working with feedlot sheep and feeding byproducts, which was fairly popular at that time for cattle, but it had not been explored for sheep yet. And so that was a very interesting experience. Also got to get some meat science experience at that time because there was a pretty heavy meats component of that project, some sensory evaluations and things like that. And really enjoyed that process. But what I learned there is that I did not want to work with sheep for my career, and I really wanted to work with cattle, and I really wanted more exposure to the feedlot industry. And so started looking for a program that would allow me the opportunity to be really involved in a feedlot and working in a research feedlot and gain that applied experience. And so for my PhD, I went to New Mexico State. And New Mexico State is a little bit unique in how the feedlot works, the research feedlot there, and where it's located. Interestingly, their research feedlot at New Mexico State is actually closer now to where I am than it is to New Mexico State campus. So it was about 8 hours away from campus at the time. And so when we'd be doing research, we would move there to the research feedlot and be living there and really kind of eat, sleep, breathe feedlot every day for, however long we were there for our study. And so that was a really great experience for me. I was able to learn a lot. I got a really great, kind of a well-rounded training, I think, in very traditional nutrition techniques, but also in trying to understand the applied aspects of feedlot nutrition. And then decided that I really loved research and wanted to help the industry in that way, and was very intellectually curious. Still am, right? That's why most of us are in the faculty positions that we are doing research. And so started applying for research positions, for faculty positions. I did a short postdoc kind of in between here for about 6 months with Texas A&M AgriLife, which is just down the road from where I'm located now in Bushland, Texas, and then got hired here at WT in 2017. And so been here at WT for a while now. You mentioned in my bio, but we do a number of things here as faculty at WT. So I'm involved in teaching, a lot of industry university service, and then of course the research side as well. And we have a university research feedlot here that I'm a part of, and get to work with a number of different faculty and multidisciplinary projects that are all geared towards the feedlot industry, and then developing my own research program in nutrition as well. Really fun. We're doing a lot of really cool research now, and a lot of new things, a lot of new technology and learning new techniques, particularly as we've started really getting into trying to understand gut health and ruminal acidosis and liver abscesses and how all of those things connect together with kind of the applied side of feedlot nutrition. But that's kind of where we're at now in terms of the research program.
Excellent. And how does a typical feedlot diet look like in the Texas Panhandle?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Of course, there's going to be variation in every diet, right? And the feedlot industry, I would say, in terms of what we're feeding, it can be a little bit regional, right? And that's mostly based primarily on feedstuff availability.
Yes.
What our diet is going to look like here in the Texas Panhandle or in the Southern Plains is a little bit different maybe than, the Midwest or up in the North, based on a couple different things. Most of it is feedstuff availability, but also, some inventory considerations and things like that. And so here in the Texas Panhandle, it depends if you're what type of diet you're talking about, right? Now we're going to have typically a receiving diet, which is going to be that first diet that you're going to feed the cattle when they come in. That's going to contain a greater proportion of fiber in it. And then you're going to have a finishing diet, which is the diet that animal is probably going to be on for the majority of its life, that contains a greater proportion of grain to enhance growth and carcass composition and things like that. And there's a number of different ways that you can kind of transition in between. But for the most part, most of our diets here in a feedlot diet, it's going to be fairly grain based. And so our most common grain type would be steam flaked corn. Steam flaking is very popular, helps us enhance that starch availability in the rumen and really helping those animals improve their gain. Depending on how we're feeding those cattle and how those cattle are owned, we also have some logistical advantages of that, and in terms of an inventory gain, depending on how those animals are managed. Mm-hmm. And so that would be the majority of our diets. A lot of our diets also have byproduct inclusion, whether it's a wet corn gluten feed, something like Sweet Brand, which is a branded product. We have also wet distillers, probably a little bit less byproduct inclusion overall down here in the Panhandle than we see somewhere like Nebraska, for example. Probably a little bit more byproduct feeding up there. Up there, we would also tend to see less steam flaking, more use of high moisture corn and dry rolled corn, which we don't see as much of down here. So the byproducts and the grain processing are a little bit different by region. And so that concentrate portion of the diet, which would include, the grain, the byproduct, liquids, supplement, that's gonna take up the most of the diet in a finishing diet. And then we have the roughage. So roughage down here, you can kind of see a little bit of everything. Typically, in most diets, depending on the roughage source you're using in the finishing diet, that would range anywhere from 7 to 10% on a dry matter basis. In that diet, I would say would be typical. If you're using silage, that would be more. Maybe you're more in, a 10 to 15%, depending on the type of silage you're using and what your grain inclusion is. Silage is fairly popular as a roughage source. We also see corn stalks, things like cottonseed hulls, even some alfalfa, maybe hay grazer. Typically in a feedlot diet, we're using that fiber for primarily rumen health as opposed to the nutrients we're getting, because those nutrients are going to be included in more of that concentrate portion of the diet to get those animals to gain. And we really think of fiber more from a rumen health standpoint. In addition to that, we do use some liquids. Fat is very common. We're seeing a lot more palm oil type of products now than we have in previous years. So that's becoming more popular, but still do see tallow and some yellow grease and some of those other things still being used depending on price. And then a number of popular feed additives are used in these diets as well. Things like monensin, other ionophores, things like tylosin phosphate for liver abscess control, various beta agonists at the end of the feeding period to alter growth composition. So we have a number of in-feed technologies as well that are very important to efficiency of a feedlot animal.
That's very good. And you were discussing about fiber. And can you describe why fiber is very important in the cattle diets?
Right. So I mentioned typically those roughages, that fiber is in a finishing diet, usually a very small inclusion. And the main reason for that is we want those cattle to gain as efficiently as possible. And to do that, we need to get as much energy intake into those animals as possible. And so we really want to minimize the amount of fiber in a finishing diet. Now, typically the receiving diet, we have a greater proportion of fiber in that diet. And the reason for that is we have to adapt the microbial population to that higher concentrate diet. We want to avoid digestive upsets in those animals. And a lot of those animals that are coming into the feedlot, they would have been eating, a greater proportion of fiber. So that is what they're used to. Maybe they're coming off of a pasture, or even if they've been backgrounded before where they've eaten some type of diet, it is probably a higher roughage diet. So there's some thought that if we provide a greater proportion of that feed stuff that they have some familiarity with, we can help their intake get a little bit started and then kind of transition later on those animals. But really, minimizing roughage is key to be able to have efficient growth, but also there's some logistical challenges associated with roughage. It's harder on mixing equipment. It's bulkier, right? So you may have to make more passes with that feed truck to be able to deliver, and, just wear and tear on the equipment, the people, and all of that kind of adds up. So really that there's a reason why that roughage is minimized in the diet that animal is going to be fed probably the majority of its lifetime that it spends in the feedlot. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that roughage is important at all. And we've actually done some studies where we've removed roughage completely. There is some other research evaluating that as well. But I think kind of the paradigm of the industry is we need to have roughage in there to maintain gut health. So roughage does a couple of things. First, it helps to dilute some of the starch. It also provides what we call scratch factor within the rumen of the animal, which essentially means that we're getting some physical stimulation on that rumen wall to those papillae, which are going to be really helpful for absorbing the volatile fatty acids that are giving these animals energy, and increases blood flow to the area, increases papillae growth, and hopefully increases absorptive capacity. The other thing that roughage can stimulate is rumination. And we know that rumination is important because not only is that helping the animal chew its food when they're regurgitating that roughage and breaking down the particle size again and again, but every time that the animal does that, they have saliva production happening, right? And so in that saliva is going to be dilution, but also there's bicarb in the saliva. And so that's going to serve some buffering capacity as well. And so we want to make sure that we have at least a little bit of that in the diet to kind of maintain the gut health of that animal when we're really providing them with a lot of starch that's going to have rapid fermentation. We want to kind of counteract that with some of that fiber in there to provide some of those advantages. So it's really a balance between how do we minimize and do this in the most efficient way, but also in a way that maintains the health and productivity of the animal.
Yeah, that is really important. And can you? I mean, I don't have a lot of experience on fiber. Is all fiber the same, or there are different fractions in that fiber?
That's a great question. So, that's actually what we've been exploring in our lab. And I think that's a question that's also come up quite a bit with the use of these fibrous byproducts, things like wet distillers, dried distillers, sweet bran, wet corn gluten feed, whatever. Those are very interesting feedstuffs, very, very interesting. They're they don't really fit into any other category. And in a way, they're almost kind of in between a grain and a roughage because they're not a roughage. Typically, they have smaller particle size than a roughage would, right? But they have higher energy than a roughage and they have less starch than a grain. So they're kind of an anomaly, I think, a little bit. And we're still trying to understand, are those fiber? Can we count them as fiber? What is the roughage contribution of those? And so there is maybe some contribution from those to the roughage portion of the diet. I think it's dependent on the byproduct we're talking about. And then we have more of the traditional fiber sources, right? Which is going to be something like our alfalfa or corn stalks or whatever. Then we have silage, which is in kind of its own category. And then we have some of these other byproducts like hulls and things like that. So there are a lot of fiber sources available. They're probably not all the same in terms of the buffering capacity that they provide. And so that is kind of an emerging area of research that we're trying to understand. What are the value of these different roughage sources? How do they compare to one another? And we're really able to do that a little bit more now that we have more technology to kind of measure some of the outputs associated with rumen health and what we're trying to get out of these fibrous ingredients in the diet. Things like, can we monitor how pH is affected or how rumination is affected or even how performance is affected, right? Which is probably the most important thing. And trying to understand what these different fibrous byproduct sources or fibrous traditional ingredients are providing. And so we've started to look at fiber also different ways. We've looked at fiber in terms of, okay, what is the total neutral detergent fiber NDF concentration? What is the ADF concentration? What is roughage NDF, which is specifically the NDF that's coming only from a traditional roughage source? We've also been looking at physically effective NDF, which is different. And so there's a number of different ways that we can kind of evaluate the contribution of fiber. And I think we're still learning that right now.
It's very interesting because you're talking about, like, when you are receiving that cattle, you need a lot of fiber. And then when you are finishing, you need less of that fiber. But it seems like a lot of these ingredients that are available now can help you with those transitions, right? Because like DDGS or wet DDGS, as you are discussing, they have like a lot of fiber, but they have a lot of other nutrients too that are useful for the cattle.
Right. Yeah. I think that's the advantage of some of these byproducts is I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of logistical challenges with a high fiber diet, and the byproducts alleviate some of those to some extent. They also are probably more cost effective, right? Because they have more energy. So you're not totally diluting the energy out. And typically what we see in a feedlot diet, what the historic research would suggest, at least in finishing cattle, is that if we increase the roughage proportion in that diet, we actually see a boost in intake. Those cattle are going to eat more, but they typically never recover or they never compensate in terms of their performance, even though they're eating more, because the total energy density of that diet is less. And so with byproducts, we can potentially kind of avoid that, right? Because they have a higher energy concentration than a roughage does, but they're maybe contributing some fiber. So maybe it's kind of like a dual purpose ingredient, right? Where it's giving us value in multiple places.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we still don't fully understand, as I was mentioning earlier, what is the roughage value, is what we like to call it, of these byproducts, right? And so I think a lot of that depends on particle size, because it is very different than a traditional roughage. It's a lot smaller. And so all of our research would suggest, for example, that if we put these byproducts in a diet, they're not really stimulating rumination, because they're a small particle size, which is an important component of the total buffering of the animal, because there is buffering contributed by saliva and those things. But is that the only thing that's important? Probably not, right? Like, is starch dilution important? It probably is. Or is there, a fiber mat maybe being created with some of these products to some extent in the rumen? Are they being retained more than a concentrate because they are fiber? Like, all of these things we don't know, and we're still trying to figure out. I think for most, based on the work we've done and what I've heard in the industry, most would probably say in a distiller's product, there probably isn't a lot of fiber value. But maybe in something like a corn gluten feed type of product, there is maybe a little bit more roughage value in that type of product, which tends to have a larger particle size. So that makes sense. But we're still looking at that. All the original kind of early work on these byproducts was really evaluating them as a replacement for corn and the grain in the diet. But we haven't spent much time looking at them. There is some, but much time looking at them from a fiber standpoint, and what are they doing, both in an applied setting, but then also really getting into what happens in the rumen with these products. What does the rumen look like, and what's going on there? So that's an important area of research that needs to continue, and we've been trying to kind of focus on in the last couple of years in our lab as well.
Yeah, and the other thing that you did mention before is that you also look at liver abscesses. Why do they occur? Is not enough fiber in the diet, or is related to fiber and starch concentration, or is unrelated?
So liver abscesses are a very hot topic issue right now, particularly in the Texas Panhandle. And the reason for that is we tend to have a relatively high prevalence of liver abscesses compared to some other places. So typically in our region, what we call a native animal, so a traditional beef animal, the liver abscess prevalence there would probably range to about 20 to 30% of the animals that go to the packing plant. The other thing that's happening about why it's becoming so popular is we're starting to feed in this region, and also in many others, a lot more of dairy, beef, crossed cattle. That's becoming very popular. And for some reason, those animals have a much higher proportion of liver abscesses, like maybe more like 50 to 60% of the animals in that dairy and beef crossed animals. So it's become a really big research area in the past couple of years as we've tried to kind of navigate that and determine why that prevalence is happening. Kind of the historic view or historically accepted etiology for liver abscesses is that it is related to ruminal acidosis.
Okay.
And so the thought process there is, we have these animals, and not every animal in the feedlot is going to have ruminal acidosis. And there's certainly animals likely in the feedlot that have a low ruminal pH and are somehow adapting to that pH. But in a proportion of animals, they're going to respond negatively to that low pH. And if they have a low pH for a sustained period of time, which is probably the most important part, is how long the rumen is exposed to that, it can create a problem called rumenitis. And so essentially what that is we have lesions, right, that develop on the rumen wall. And the bacteria population that lives in the rumen then has a way to kind of escape out of the rumen, go into portal circulation, and all of the gut mass essentially is drained through the portal vein, which goes to the liver. And so it allows those bacteria to get out of the rumen when they're normally, they're found in the rumen very commonly, but they're not supposed to be in the liver. And so when they get to the liver, they're essentially creating an infection that the liver then walls off and it forms an abscess. And so that's kind of the accepted paradigm on how these abscesses occur. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot we don't know about how they occur. We're finding out now. A lot of the research would suggest there's other primarily we thought there was one bacteria that was kind of the causative agent of all of this. And we're finding out now there's probably multiple bacteria that are involved in this process. We're finding out now that it may not just be the rumen. There may be post-ruminal effects that are happening. Maybe we have leaky gut happening kind of downstream that could also be contributing to this. And so we're doing a lot of research now still to understand what the pathogenesis of this disorder is. And I think we have kind of a starting place, but it's really an exciting time as researchers are out there developing models and things like this to really understand this better.
That's really good, and that's what keep us busy, right, Kendall? In the academia, there is always, like a very interesting research area.
It's time for our famous three.
Now, I would like to ask you three final questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So, what is your favorite industry-related book or resource?
I guess that answer is different depending if it's a resource or just a book that I've felt to be impactful. Mm-hmm. But probably the most common resource I use right now to find information is peer-reviewed journal articles, right? And for me, one of the peer-reviewed journals that I review the most is probably Applied Animal Science. There's a lot of great research in there that is geared towards the feedlot industry, and a lot of that is really producer-focused research that has a lot of application. So that's a really, really neat journal to be able to go through and see what other people are doing. In terms of like a book that I've read that was most impactful to me in my career, I would say as a resource, there's a couple different books. The Church book on ruminant nutrition, that's kind of, everyone views that as kind of their go-to ruminant nutrition book. And I remember reading that book like front to cover in grad school and that being really valuable to me at that time. I also suggest all my grad students buy that book. So that one is a really good one that I refer to often when I'm teaching or trying to explain concepts to others.
Excellent. What about like, any favorite book or a resource outside of agriculture or, like not related to your profession?
So that's a good question. I would say as a faculty member, I don't honestly, maybe I shouldn't admit this, but I honestly don't get much time to read for pleasure reading outside. Usually I'm reading some article, and those two have kind of meshed together in my mind almost. Like if I'm reading a scientific article and I'm enjoying it at the same time. I think most of us in academia are a little bit weird that way, that those two kind of come together. But there definitely have been some good books I've read over time. One of my favorite books is Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. That's a really good one that I would recommend. Kind of more of like a little bit of a personal development book, but that book was recommended to me and I thought it was a really, really good read. And I also recommend that one to students as well to read.
That the book that tells you that you need to invest like 10,000 hours
Yes.
to be an expert in an area, right?
Yes. Yeah, that it's a good one.
Yeah, it's a good book.
I think as a grad student reading that, it made me feel good about all the time that I was spending doing my research projects. So
We could count the hours, just how close are we getting to the 10,000 word to the
yeah.
10,000 hours, right? And in your opinion, what distinguishes a successful feedlot professional in the cattle industry?
Yeah, so I think I mean, of course, having a background is important and an understanding of the industry is important, but I think for the feedlot industry, there's a lot of maybe soft skills or kind of intangible skills that are beneficial. First, the feedlot industry and many other sectors of agriculture are like this as well, but I would say, in my opinion, it's really a systems-based industry. It's not just one thing. As a feedlot nutritionist, rarely do I just get to be a feedlot nutritionist. Like putting a diet together is an extremely small proportion of what most nutritionists do on a day-to-day basis. You have to have an interest and an understanding in a lot of other sectors. And so I think that really helps those people that are able to understand that you have to be pretty well versed and well rounded in different areas. Like you have to have an understanding of economics, right? You have to have an understanding of nutrition is important, but you have to have an understanding of health, of mechanical type things, logistics type things. And people management, because really you're working with people every day, regardless of what role you're in, and really doing a lot of teaching and training. And so kind of being well-rounded and being able to understand all of those different aspects of the industry, I think is pretty critical. The other thing that I would say is just being observant and attention to detail. And I think that doesn't always come naturally to everybody, right? But in this business, it's a very small margin that you have, right, to be successful in terms of business. And so it's really those little details that are going to add up to the best efficiency and taking all of those things into account. So being able to look out and see those very small things and make changes, I think is an important part of being successful as well.
Yeah, that is very important, especially when you're talking also about economics, right? The cheapest or the cheapest diet might not be the best one or the most expensive neither. It's important to have a good balance.
Right. And everybody has a different way of looking at success, right? Like for some people, maybe that's feed conversion, maybe it's cost to gain, maybe it's what I get paid for the carcass, right? And there's different ways that you could look at it, and depending who that is, it could pencil out different for each person. So understanding those things and what goes into that and that decision making is pretty important part of the process.
Yeah, well, that concludes another episode of the Feed Science Podcast Show presented by West Genetics. Thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to subscribe and stay updated on future episodes. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave us a comment. And thank you, Dr. Kendall, and thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a blessed day.
Yeah, thank you as well.